Hello, my name is Richard. I'm the pastor at the King's Church in Addlestone in Surrey, and I'm continuing to talk about money. If you remember a few weeks ago, we looked at this idea that actually everything that we have, everything in the world, everything that anyone has, still all belongs to God. And with that in mind, there's a verse that is repeated in the Anglican liturgy that says, "All things come from you, and of your own do we give you." So there's this understanding that everything we give in worship is actually God's in the first place. And everything that we're left with is a gift that God gives us to know what to do with, to steward well in the world around us. So today I'm going to look at the idea of generosity in the church. If you look at the early church, you'll see that it is characterized by generosity. In Acts chapter 2, we find this. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. So there was generosity within the local church community. And then in Acts chapter 11, we find this. During this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. This happened during the reign of Claudius. The disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea. This they did, sending their gifts to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. So there you see a generosity that goes across the global church, not just within the local church community, but they're sending finances and resources across some distance to their brothers and sisters in another part of the world. So generosity, sharing is a key characteristic in the church. Now, I'm going to tell you a story to start with. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because I was reminded of this when I read a parable, which I'll come to in a second. But let me tell you the story first. So when I was a child, my dad was working for British Airways. He worked for British Airways for a long time. And one of the perks of working for British Airways was that we as a family got staff discounted travel, which meant we would pay sometimes 10% of the ticket price to go to places. And, so that meant we travelled quite a lot to different parts of the world, which was amazing. It was a great privilege. And it sounds great, but there is a flip side on staff travel, which is that you have to fly standby nearly all the time. Standby means that you go to the flight and you just wait for how many people get on a flight. If there's 4 spaces, then the family of 4 can get on. If there's not, you have to make a decision whether only 3 of you go or only 2 of you go. And that's just how standby works. So it kind of meant that holidays was a little bit stressful because we'd always kind of not quite sure whether we'd get on. And it often meant that we'd have to take sometimes slightly convoluted routes to get to different places. And so this is what happened on this particular occasion. We were going to Florida and we went via Chicago O'Hare Airport, which was at the time the busiest airport in the world. And I can't remember quite how this happened, but we ended up having to transfer a flight. I don't know whether we either got kicked off the British Airways flight because there was no longer any room when people were joining the flight in Chicago, or whether it was all planned anyway. But either way, we had to get across Chicago Airport. Maybe the flight coming in was delayed as well, with a limited amount of time. It was something like crazy, like half an hour. And so bear in mind, when you land in Chicago, we would have to then enter the US, so we had to go through immigration, we had to get our luggage, and I can remember running through the airport with a suitcase on my head just to try and lift it above all the masses of, it was like Piccadilly Circus, there was people everywhere, so you had to just get there as quick as possible. And we managed to navigate our way across the airport, got to the gate, just about in time, not quite sure whether we'd get on this flight. And we can all remember as a family, this, because the staff on the gate said, the Foxes. And here the Foxes were, and we got there, and actually we had caused the plane, they'd held the plane back for us because they knew we were coming. And we caused the plane to be slightly delayed, which meant we missed our takeoff slot, which meant the plane was delayed quite a lot. Anyway, in the meantime, we get on the plane and find that they've put us in first class. You find sometimes that airline staff look after airline staff. So here we are, we've made the plane late, we're now in first class, we're sitting amongst people who are looking at us and probably thinking, these people don't fit in first class. It was very obvious we didn't fit in first class. I'm going around like, I can't believe I'm here. We're all kind of wow, wow, wow. I have to tell you, the food was amazing. I remember having the best ice cream on this flight, and there was a selection of films you could watch, which back in those days was just like unheard of. We got to sit right at the front of a 747. It was pretty special. And anyway, here we are sitting there in first class. We were the ones who made the plane late. We were the ones who paid next to nothing for this flight. And here we are surrounded by people who've paid a lot of money to sit in first class, only to find that their plane is now delayed by us who paid nothing or next to nothing. And that was the situation. So you can imagine how we felt. We were over the moon. But you can also imagine how the other passengers felt, who probably felt a little bit miffed that we'd made the plane late. We hadn't paid anywhere near what they had paid to go in first class, and here we were all sitting together eating this nice ice cream. So that's the story. Now, why am I telling you that? Because it reminded me, if you just put yourself in the shoes of those people in that story, it reminded me of a parable that Jesus spoke, which is this, in Matthew 20. It says, "For the kingdom of heaven," and remember that, the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius. A denarius is about a day's wages, for doing a day, and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning, he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing around here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard, said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going to the first." The workers who were hired at about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. So when those who had been hired first, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who are hired last worked only an hour," they said, "and you've made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give one who was hired the last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. So I wonder if you can see the parallel between this parable and the story I told you of my childhood on a flight. But let's just look at this parable. There are 3 main characters. You've got the landowner, who seems, if I'm honest, to have a little bit more money than sense. You've got the hard-working labourers who are ready to work first in the morning, and they wanted to work and they just got on with it and did a whole 12-hour shift and a hard day in the sun. And then you've got these kind of shady characters who weren't there first thing in the morning. In fact, they seem to have a very long lie-in when they're only around at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And they're just sort of hanging around, and it's like, well, nobody's hired us, you know. You wonder whether they've, I don't know. They just seem like a bunch of losers, really. And yet they're hired to do an hour's work at the end. I mean, there are other people that are hired through the story, but these are the main characters. Now, the hard workers, they'd agreed a fair price, a denarius, which was a fair price for a day's work in those days. So they did their 12-hour shift knowing that that's what they would get paid. Now, these slightly dubious characters who'd only worked an hour by the end of the day, they'd missed the heat of the day, they'd probably missed the hard work of the day as well. When it comes to pay time, at the end of the day, the owner pays them a day's wage, a whole denarius, for doing 1 hour, for basically just turning up. It's like doing an exam by just writing your name on the front page and then getting an A star. I mean, that's what happened. So when it came to the workers who'd worked the full day, they started to get a bit excited because they're thinking, well, he's been rather generous to those people who only did an hour's work, so surely we're in for a bonus. Surely we're going to get a little bit more than a denarius because I mean, we've done 11 hours more work than these guys. And they get paid, and they get a denarius, 1 day's wage. And then they get annoyed. And if I'm honest, quite rightly so, because they say, you've made us equal with, they didn't say it, but I'm sure they were thinking it. These losers who have only done an hour's work, you've given them a day's pay, you've given us a day's pay, you've made us equal. This is not right. It is not fair. I wonder if you agree with that. Do you agree with that? I mean, I have to say, I kind of agree. But the landowner says, I paid you what we agreed. That's fair, right? I mean, we agreed a denarius for the day's work. I gave you a denarius. I mean, it's up to me if I want to be generous with my own money, if I want to give these guys who worked an hour, if I want to give them more than they deserve. That's up to me, right? He says, are you envious because of my generosity? And that's how Jesus leaves this parable. I mean, it's outrageous, really, what's going on here. And Jesus leaves it with this hanging question, which is, are you envious because of my generosity? Remember, he starts the parable by saying, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. It seems that the generosity in God is given to the undeserving, and it seems unfair at times. But actually, this is the characteristic of the kingdom of heaven. Generosity towards those who don't deserve it. And if that's what Jesus says the kingdom is like, then surely that should be reflected in the way of the church. This kind of unfair generosity should abound amongst God's people. Being generous towards those who we feel are deserving, it isn't actually that hard, is it? You know, people who we think deserve generosity, then it's not that difficult to be generous towards them. But being generous towards those who we feel are undeserving, who in fact we probably think actually deserve punishment rather than reward, that's hard. Let me be really honest with you. As you know, we have a food bank session here on a Friday, and I'm there most weeks. And I'll be honest with you, there are some people who come in, you hear their story, you find out about their situation, and you make a judgment. We shouldn't, right? We shouldn't make judgments. Jesus says don't judge, but we do. And you think these people really deserve help. And empathy and pity, they just well up, and mercy is very easy in these kind of situations, especially when you're giving away stuff that other people have donated. I mean, it's very easy to be generous in those kind of situations. But then, if I'm honest, others come in and you listen to their story, or you think, is this really a story? And you take one look at them and you make a judgment. And Jesus says we shouldn't, but we do. And you start to think things like, oh, these people, they've created their own problems, or they have enough actually, they don't really need to be here, or they're really just not trying. They need to just pull their finger out and actually do some work, and their problems will probably just go away. They don't really deserve help. And if I'm honest, empathy and pity are hard to generate in those kind of situations. Generosity is hard in those situations, but actually generosity, just like love, is oftentimes a decision that needs to be made. And that's where the generosity of Jesus is different to maybe generosity we might experience in other places. Because it is relatively easy to be generous to those who are deserving. I mean, still takes a bit of sort of, you've got to give, but it's quite easy to be generous towards those who we deem are deserving. But we're called beyond that. Jesus says we're called to be generous to those who deserve it, but also to be equally as generous to those who don't. Because that is the way of Jesus. Christ-like generosity gives way beyond what merit deserves. And that's what the kingdom's like. Jesus said it. This is what the kingdom's like. This kingdom is like this. And so therefore, that is what the church should be like. That is what we should be like. So, in our lives, let us build in a healthy dose of unfair generosity. Unfair generosity. With the things and the money that we have, let us learn to be unfairly generous with it. Now that will probably take some reflection on this parable, on what we've talked about today, maybe some prayer, some inner searching. But I challenge you to listen to these words of Jesus, to understand what the kingdom is like, and see how that fits with you, and see how we can be like that as a people and as a church. Grace and peace to you in Christ. Amen. Thanks for watching again. As usual, you know what to do. You can hit the like, you can hit the share, you can leave a comment. I'd love to hear your comments. I mean, what do you think about that parable? Do you think that's fair? Is God fair? Is God fair? Ooh, there's a good question. Let me know. Bless you.